Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished speaker today is Baroness Shriti Vadera, Chair of Prudential PLC. Shriti has had a distinguished career in both the public and private sectors. She was an investment banker for 15 years, on the UK Treasury's Council of Economic Advisors for 8 years, and a UK government minister during the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, during which she was a key architect of the UK's bank recapitalization and funding plan, and helped design and negotiate the outcomes of the pivotal G20 London summit in 2009. Over the last decade, she has been a board member of a number of major global companies. She's also noted for her leadership in championing diversity and sustainability issues. Very impressive and brilliant indeed. Without further ado, let's welcome Baroness Shriti Vadera. Good morning, Shriti. How nice to see you. Although I think a lot of us, myself included, would very much like to meet up with you here in Hong Kong. But thank you for agreeing to join us at this webinar today. Would you like to say a few words of welcome to the audience?
Thank you, Moses. That was an over-generous introduction, and it's lovely to be here with you. Sadly, not in person, but I hope soon that we'll be able to be together. And I'm so sorry about the situation that is being faced everywhere. It's very sad to see, but I hope to be there soon.
Thank you, Shriti. Let me firstly extend to you and Prudential PLC our congratulations for releasing a set of very good 2021 full year results. Could you give us some highlights of where your businesses are going, particularly in Asia? And what do you think are the key business opportunities and challenges for 2022?
Thank you, Moses. Yeah, we're very pleased with the results, which are really a testament to the commitment of our people and the resilience of our business model. We delivered high quality growth despite some rather challenging conditions, I may say, in the last few months. In 9 of our 14 markets, in fact, we saw double-digit growth. Mainland China is now our biggest market for sales. In Hong Kong, of course, the China border being closed has meant that one of our significant segments is closed. But in our domestic segment in Hong Kong, our new business profits were up 9%. And we've increased our number of life insurance customers by over 1 million. So we did very well under the circumstances. I guess in terms of opportunities, Moses, I would say that we have created a new Prudential. Last year was one of the most significant periods of change in the company's 174-year history. We completed a strategic repositioning and now focus solely on Asia and Africa. And I don't need to tell this audience what that means in terms of potential. There are relatively low levels of insurance cover in Asia, high levels of out-of-pocket health and protection spend, demographic trends that contribute to surging needs for healthcare and financial security. And at the same time, there's new technology that makes it easier to reach customers from younger and lower income groups. So for the Pru, all our attention and resources is going to go to knowing these customers better, investing in products that meet their needs, and finding new ways to reach them with distribution capabilities. And we're going to increase our focus on healthcare. So it's a very exciting period. I'm not going to imply that there are no challenges, but it's a very exciting period for us.
Wonderful, wonderful. The issue you have highlighted for Prudential actually reflected the unprecedented challenges that many of our Academy of Fellows members and friends are dealing with day in and day out. The IMF recently adjusted downward its 2022 global growth forecast and warned that the emergence of new COVID-19 variants could prolong the pandemic and induce renewed economic disruption. Now, based on your experience dealing with crisis, what are the key issues that leaders should focus on tackling the uncertainties brought about by the pandemic?
Thanks, Moses. The challenges that worry me the most at the moment are not, there's lots to pick from. There are lots to pick from in terms of challenges. It's the fact that there's a confluence of them that is really difficult, because fighting on multiple fronts is much harder. And in addition to sort of seeing a very uneven recovery because of COVID, we are seeing, very tragic human crisis in Ukraine, which will have a serious effect on the global economy, particularly through commodity prices. And then we have these sort of macro inflationary, possibly stagflationary pressures, which we haven't seen in a generation, in fact. And it feels to me like we're entering a different phase in the global political economy. And history will see, I think, the consequences of the financial crisis as a turning point, and as a part of the same continuum as rapid technological change, rising nationalism, protectionism, and populism. And, for Moses, for you, for those of us, shall I say, of a generation who've spent most of our professional lives in the great economic moderation, and we at the height we had the faith and power of globalization to unite and enrich us. We should consider ourselves lucky, actually, and perhaps in retrospect a little naive. And we're now entering a different phase. If you'd asked me the question about what would I say leaders should focus on given this environment, if you'd asked me that a month ago, or frankly even 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have hesitated to say they should focus on global coordination. But, with the conflict in Ukraine and the most rapid surge in refugees in Europe since the Second World War, it seems a little pitiful at this time to be preaching coordination. But for me, there are still things that are not totally impossible to ask for more cooperation. And the pandemic has illustrated this perfectly. The COVID response was extremely good on science and technology with vaccines and Zoom, but really a bit of a failure on global governance and coordination. If by virtue of its ability to spread contagion, financial, economic, climate change, health, if a phenomenon is global, then obviously a globally coordinated response is needed. And so I continue to argue that until we have higher levels of effective vaccination in every corner of the world, no one is really safe, as the risks of new variants emerging will remain. And if it's not altruism, at least self-interest should drive us to better distribution of vaccines. And the risks are also in the second and third round effects of the pandemic, which have cracked wide open and deepened the fissures and the inequities that already existed. We were already living in a world of increasing concentration and growth and capital in some sectors and some companies, even individuals, and where ordinary people felt that they were no longer participating fairly in wealth creation and these great advances in society. And COVID has put these trends on steroids. So there are millions of people who've been pushed into extreme poverty. It's halting and in places reversing a trend of poverty alleviation. Young people, those in personal service sectors, in the informal economy, women have been the hardest hit. In December, the Asian Development Bank's report suggests that young people suffered twice the level of job losses. And studies all across the world are showing students losing lifelong earnings potential, productivity, their future employment opportunities. So I think combating the injustices of the distribution of these effects should be a priority. For me, that was a lesson from the financial crisis. There was this long tail of disruption, and we declared victory far too soon. And in some parts of the world, they're still living with the consequences of the very unjust and quite long-lived distribution of pain. For COVID, it's very uneven, as I said. It's an uneven picture of economic impact. Advanced economies provided a lot of fiscal support, equivalent to about 28% of their GDP. And for emerging and developing economies, they could only afford sort of about 7% and 2%, respectively. So the scarring, the economic scarring, the loss of GDP per capita in emerging markets over a 4-year period is expected to be double that of advanced economies. And if you add inflation shocks and the squeeze on the cost of living, this is going to be really difficult for governments and households. And political and geopolitical risk are very high now on the risk registers of all companies in a way they really just weren't a decade ago. So I hope this time, post-COVID, we will be prepared and not surprised by the instability that can follow if you don't tackle some of these longer-term trends that COVID has forced us to confront.
Very much indeed, Shriti. And I think recently when I talked to my friends in the financial sector, inflation and rising interest rates have been the focus of the financial market in recent months, with many analysts arguing that shares of financial institutions, including insurance companies, would benefit from inflation and rising interest rates. However, given a long history of falling and low interest rates in the past few decades, with the result that global debt levels and various forms of carry trade have built up massively, should we be prepared for market turbulences? What do you think are the key issues leaders in financial institutions should focus on in a period of rising interest rates? How far is Asia similar to or different from the major industrial countries in this respect?
I agree with you that inflation and as I said before, possibly stagflation should be a very serious focus for financial institutions. And not least, there are policy risks of central bankers kind of falling off this tightrope of they're trying to curb inflation, but not break so hard as to jeopardize recovery. Sort of being Goldilocks, isn't very easy. And it's particularly hard when there are so many exogenous factors that affect inflation, like COVID, supply chain impacts, Ukraine commodity price increases. So in this situation, what should we, all of us as financial institution leaders, do? I guess I would start with something you may not expect me to say, which is that I think that key executives should brush up on economic and financial history. And I even suggested that to the Bank of England that it should have a test before it approved individuals for key roles. Because the assessment, as you said, the assessment of credit and other risks has been really blunted with more than a decade of not yet unwound, ultra-loose monetary support. And that's masked a lot of hidden risks in global markets. So yes, to your point on global turbulence, we will have a lot of it. And adjusting to inflation and monetary tightening could be quite a novel experience for some younger professionals. In my first year of work, interest rates in the UK rose from 9 to 14.5%, which just goes to show you how old I am. So institutional memory is important. Of course, in Asia, there is, in fact, a fair amount of it in dealing with crisis, but perhaps of a different type. The second, I think, is we need to really understand the unique differentiators between markets. There's a generic view of that the market sometimes takes, dollar rate rises means disruption and capital outflow risks for depreciation, outflow risks for emerging markets, and that's like a blanket view. That is not the case. It will, of course, vary depending on the levels of foreign exchange debt, on the level of reserves, whether the country is a commodity importer or an exporter. And so understanding these risks with a real economic granularity is important. I mean, for example, for the first time, China may not follow the Fed and, in fact, could cut rates to support the Chinese economy. And so the central banks of the two largest economies in the world could be moving in opposite directions, which is historically unprecedented and the market has no experience of. And as you would expect me to say, Moses, lastly, I would say that we should be thinking of the wider societal issues, particularly the cost of living squeeze on customers and on citizens. And in Asia, there is a really good understanding about the role of financial institutions in wider societal events, but we can't be complacent as we head into this new phase.
Absolutely. Well, talking about risk management, I think following the strategic transformation of Prudential over recent years, your company is now focused on Asia and Africa. Naturally, the business opportunities in Asia and Africa are obviously huge, but so are the risks of operating in many of the developing countries in these places. Now, could you share with us your experience and thoughts in how such risks should be managed?
Well, next year, the Pru will celebrate its 100th year in Asia. And I suspect that means we've been through a few risky situations. And managing risk is the definition of insurance. People outsource that management to us. It's our core activity. And key for us is the long-term perspective. When we enter a market, we expect to be there for decades. And we make promises to customers which will mature over decades. And we match those liabilities with long-term investments. I'm not saying that makes an insurer immune from risk, but it does give you a different perspective based on the longer-term trends on the underlying economic and social drivers. For me, one key risk management approach is to align our operations with our customers, with long-term public policy and with regulation. You know, Moses, better than anyone, that regulators are always trying to do the right thing by consumers. So we may have differences of views about the how with our regulators sometimes, but very seldom about the why. And by aligning with societal purpose and by seeking to understand what regulators are actually trying to achieve, that reduces our business risks. We also, in many markets, reduce risk by playing a role in supporting the maturing of domestic capital markets. Eastspring, our asset manager, is that long-term investor in these markets. So for me, if our presence benefits customers and we contribute to markets' prosperity and development, that reduces our risk as a business.
Great. Now let's turn to talk about a little bit about China and Hong Kong. Prudential has strong ties with Hong Kong, as you just alluded to. It is listed and has sizable operation in Hong Kong. Many of your senior executives are based here, and the Hong Kong Insurance Authority is Prudential's group-wide supervisor. In recent years, however, stresses in the relationship between China and the West have intensified. And more recently, travel restrictions arising from the pandemic has made traveling to Hong Kong difficult, if not impossible. Going forward, how would you deal with these difficulties in the context of Prudential's global and regional strategy of placing more emphasis on Asia and Africa?
Firstly, I would say to our friends and our colleagues and customers and partners in Hong Kong, we appreciate how difficult the pandemic's been, and we're here to support you. And as you say, Moses, we have a big business there. We've been there for 60 years almost, and we have head office executives. I think some of them are in the audience. We have a listing. We've recently raised equity there. And we chose our regulator in Hong Kong. So when we announced our leadership changes last month, we said our new group CEO will be based here, so in Hong Kong. So we have made our choices clear. We are an Asian and African company now, and this is where we're going to be. Hong Kong is remarkably resilient, and I'm sure we'll overcome these challenges. We can't shy. Can't be shy about the fact that, like other multinational companies based here right now, it's challenging for senior people not being able to travel around the region when their job is to oversee the businesses elsewhere. But you've got to take a long-term perspective, and being long-term is part of our DNA. And in the short term, we'll support our people and our customers and our agents and our partners, and we'll see this through.
And about China, what do you think of the market potential for Prudential in China? Do you have any views on the increasing emphasis on common prosperity in China and what that means for businesses in China or in Hong Kong?
Well, as I said at the start, our Chinese joint venture became the largest contributor to group sales last year, and that's a testament to that market potential. And we're in 99 cities, 20 provinces. I think that covers about 80% of China's GDP. And we're particularly focused on areas with the greatest economic growth potential, which is aligned with the Chinese government's city cluster model that's centered on Beijing, Shanghai, and GBA. And we've got a great partnership with CITIC since 2000. The underlying drivers of the Chinese market are crystal clear, and they're very aligned to who we are at the Prudential. The long-term economics, the demographics, rising incomes, growing middle class, demand for healthcare, the focus on financial stability, the need to channel domestic savings into productive growth, that is all very aligned with our business. But when it comes to common prosperity, Moses, name me one place, one region, one country that doesn't have this as a policy priority. I mean, you can call it common prosperity, you can call it build back better in the US, or an economy that works for people in the EU, or leveling up in the UK. They're all variations of the same theme. It's about recognizing inequality and equity and ensuring that we focus not just on growth, but on higher quality, more inclusive growth. Yes, Asia's lifted people out of poverty at a rate never seen in history before. At the same time, there are clear concerns about rising inequality and the concentration of wealth and capital. And, digital transformation has contributed to growth, of course, but it can also drive this concentration. And how we respond must be a priority for all of us. And this is about the sustainability of growth and prosperity. Common prosperity, or whatever policymakers, wherever they are, describe it, it's very akin to the insurance sector. We pool risk to help people manage it collectively in a way that they couldn't individually. We channel individual savings into productive investment for growth. We use digital transformation not just to be more efficient, but to reach people who have previously financially excluded. When I was working in government with Gordon Brown, he used to start almost every speech with these words: "For prosperity to be sustained, it must be shared." And, at that time, I don't think we really listened. We didn't pause and pay much attention to it. It's just what Gordon did. But a lot has happened since then, and I think it really shows how pertinent what he said was.
Yeah, you mentioned about how technology has impact upon the development of the financial market. I mean, my 6 years serving as the chairman of the Insurance Authority, I can actually personally experience how the great impact of technology, or fintech, to be exact, on the development of the financial industry. Now, digitalization is transforming the financial services industry. And many up and rising fintech companies are trying to chip away business of financial institutions, while large tech fin companies have become formidable competitors. Now, Prudential have been using digital channel to reach and serve your customers. Could you share with us your thoughts on how financial leaders should manage digitalization opportunities and challenges?
Well, Moses, I agree with you. There's a lot of focus on fintech, startups, unicorns. But it's important to remember that there is more investment in technology made by incumbent financial services companies than by fintech. So I'm not suggesting that the market recognizes equivalent value for that investment, but the volume is very clear. For me, the starting point should always be customers. And I hope that's informed the Pru's approach. We've really ramped up tech investment in recent years. And we call our health and wealth management app, we call it Pulse. And in the markets where it's available, it accounts for about 11% of total sales in the recent year. And we've invested heavily to leverage technology to simplify underwriting, sales, agency training, agency recruitment, professional development. And COVID has, of course, been a huge accelerant. And we work very closely with regulators on remote sales and advisory solutions. Almost half of insurance sales were conducted virtually last year. And of course, in particular, we work very closely with HKIA on the facilitation of the distribution of life insurance products online. There's always a balance between regulation and innovation. Although there isn't always a level playing field between established players and fintech. But for us, it's really important to work closely with regulators and policymakers on financial inclusion, on operational resilience, cybersecurity, customer protection, data, etc. So that's our approach that I think is the key to success. I just want to add one thing, if I may, that technology is amazingly positive, but it's also disruptive, and not just in the way you mentioned, Moses, about being a challenger to incumbent companies, but it's also disruptive on labor markets, on jobs and skills. And we've seen from previous industrial revolutions how disruptive that can actually be for really prolonged periods of time, and that it requires fundamental shifts in policies and institutions of labor markets, of regulation, social welfare, education, in order to handle technological change well. So in societal terms, we need to work at how this transition to the future can be painless as possible, and that inevitable dislocation that happens can be mitigated as much as possible.
Okay. No. Yes, definitely. I think technology is really impacting on the market in many, many ways. And another very interesting topic that I'm sure that participants in the financial market is considering or planning day in and day out is, of course, green and sustainability. Now, another mega trend affecting the financial services and the insurance industry is naturally green and sustainability. Not only do we need to green ourselves, but we also need to manage the physical and transition risks in our assets and liabilities and help fund societies move to a greener future. However, one major concern is that a lot of green funds around the world are channeled to green companies in developed economies, such as those in Europe and the United States of America. Given your focus on Asia and Africa, how could Prudential mobilize funds to green the developing economies? And putting on your cap as an official in the government and multilateral organization, what are the key issues government should address in order to encourage more funds to invest in greening developing economies?
You're certainly hitting the big ticket issues in this session, Mrs. We've never seen leaders more focused on climate change, thanks mainly, frankly, to young people. And I do hope that the current energy security issues aren't going to reduce this focus or even mean a retreat from it. But you are absolutely right that even in the run-up to COP26 last year, there was insufficient attention on a just and inclusive transition for emerging markets. Emerging markets have contributed less to the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. They're often disproportionately affected by it. Many are much more dependent on fossil fuels for electricity, and most have less resources to finance a transition. So it's like a sort of quadruple whammy. And I would say, for me, the first issue I would like policymakers to address is something I feel very strongly is needed as a base foundation, and that is carbon pricing. Of course, the private sector is going to be a significant source of transition finance, but climate change and transition are externalities. They're global public goods. We in the private sector can only finance what is commercial. And so for the externality needs a carbon price to make it commercially financeable. However much we disclose and decarbonize our activities, the sum of fragmented private sector unregulated market actions alone will not deliver a 1.5-degree world, let alone in a just and fair way. Today only 20% of emissions are subject to carbon pricing, roughly half in carbon markets and the other half through carbon tax. But the average explicit carbon price in the global economy is $3. That's not even the right number of digits. And yes, we've seen this huge progress on voluntary carbon markets, but it's really second best, and it's currently the only thing. But it's still going to take a long time that we don't, in fact, have. I think that these leaders are abdicating responsibility because it's difficult to tell the public that there is a short-term cost that needs to be managed for a longer-term overwhelming gain. And then we need to structure for investing in transition, because right now we're not being incentivized to invest in transition. We're just being pressured to divest from fossil fuels. And transition and green bonds are great, but if you're a bond issuer who's a high emitter, but you want to use a green bond to transition to lower emissions in your business, the bonds that you issue would score against an investor's carbon intensity metrics, the so-called WACC. It's a disincentive to transition financing. So we need to change that, and we need louder emerging market voices for this standard setting. And even after that, we need practical mechanisms at scale to finance energy transition without sacrificing other development needs. Don Kanak from the Prudential, who I know who's in the session somewhere today, he came up with an idea for an energy transition mechanism that aims to both finance the accelerated retirement of coal plants and also increase investment in renewable energies. And this was launched as a pilot at COP26 with the Asian Development Bank and the governments of Indonesia and Philippines. It's a public-private partnership, and I do think that multilateral banks play a central role, and they should be judged not by how much money they lend for transition directly themselves, but by how many more multiples of funding they leverage from the private sector for it. And we would like to be a part of those solutions.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Shriti, you are very committed to promoting inclusion and diversity. Could you share with us your observations and thoughts on how developments in the past 2 years or so have affected inclusion and diversity? When the COVID pandemic resulted in occasional lockdowns, weaker economies, and more unemployment, What are your experiences in the efforts to promote and support diversity and inclusion across Asia and Africa?
You know, as I said before, that women were disproportionately affected by COVID, and it's really important that we reverse that trend. You know, that there's a huge macro effect of macroeconomic impact of improving gender inequality and empowering women. There's studies that show in Asia Pacific you could increase aggregate income by 6.5% in a generation, 14.5% in 2 generations, if you were able to deal with gender inequality. And I think at a micro corporate level, it's really important to start with the fundamental notion and premise that this is not about political correctness. It is about performance. I was on the board of BHP for 10 years. It's a sort of hard hat Australian mining company, in fact, the largest miner in the world. That's not the place you would expect to see gender diversity, shall I say. But the CEO was totally committed, and he set some targets of 50-50, which really shocked the sector and everybody. But they did something very interesting. They had the most complex SAP system in the world, and it could measure the differential performance of tires in Chile and in Australia in a mine. That's how sophisticated it was. And they tracked the performance of more and less diverse teams inside the company. And they found that the more diverse the team, the more efficient it was, and the better able to forecast its production, and the better its safety record. And that's what made those more monocultural teams suddenly say, you know what, actually, I'd like a bit of that performance, please. And then they started to think about diversity. So culture change is hard. I know that. And I know sometimes it feels like creating more opportunities for talented women means fewer opportunities for talented men. It doesn't mean that. And nurturing the most capable women and men in a competitive market makes the company and therefore everybody more successful. We've talked a lot about different types of risk today. But diversity of thinking is the protection that we have against the risk of groupthink and serious failures that come from everyone thinking the same way. That happened in the financial crisis when everybody believed this time it's different, which, by the way, is the most fatal 5 words in financial history. This time it is different. At the Pru, whether it's from representation to how we shape our products and our services, this is a journey we are all committed to, even though it's not easy. And it's not just about gender diversity, but diversity in all respects. And it's about inclusion, by which I mean people being comfortable about their differences and being accepted and able to bring the best of who they are to work.
Right. Yes, Shriti, you have a very distinguished career in both the public and private sectors. You served in the UK government before and during the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, including as a minister and in the Majesty Treasury's Council of Economic Advisor for a number of years. What are the differences and similarities between the worlds of business and politics? And which world do you feel more comfortable with? And how has your experience in government helped you succeed in your subsequent endeavors?
I would say that the biggest difference between the two sectors is the singularity of purpose in the private sector versus the multiplicity of purposes in the public sector. In the private sector, there is a unity of purpose essentially around shareholder return, notwithstanding the how of getting there. Whereas in the public sector, it's always about juggling the trade-offs of the multiplicity of purposes that you have to achieve at any point in time. And so government is a perpetual state of trade-offs and compromise. And in fact, the book that I won't, in fact, ever write about being in government, I would have the title for it, which is, it would be called A State of Compromise. And, as modern businesses strive to find the balance between shareholder goals and meeting the expectations of multiple stakeholders, which are really rapidly changing and rising for corporates. That experience of being in government really helps me to understand and accept trade-offs, and helps me grapple with the complexity of political, geopolitical risks, but also societal changes and society's changing expectations of corporates. And it's taught me to be more resilient in the face of short-term pressures, and to focus on the longer-term goals, which sustain ourselves. That's what we need to sustain ourselves as a business. And for me, that's why the PRU is important to me, and that's why I'm so happy to be here, is that its social purpose and its shareholder success are sort of inextricably linked. As to which world, that's a difficult question. I would say I view the world as a series of circles in a Venn diagram, where there's public policy, politics, which I'm not very fond of, and economics and macro and markets and commercial. And the answers and the true interest of life usually lies where the Venn diagram meets in the middle. And that's the space I like to inhabit.
Great. All right, we just have a little bit of time before we move to the question and answer session. Can I ask you about what you took up last year as the chair of the Royal Shakespeare Company? Could you tell us a little bit about how that would go on the way of letting you to pursue your passion and drama and English literature?
Well, I grew up in Africa and in India before I went to Britain. And I didn't have very much to read. I was a voracious reader, but I never could, get my hands on enough to read. And when I was 14, we were doing Julius Caesar at school, and I couldn't find the text in a standalone text. We just got it in the complete works. So that's all I had to read. So I read the complete works. I mean, of course, I didn't understand all of it, most of it, I suspect, but I'd read it a couple of times by the time I was 15. So these were my role models. I didn't have other role models. So all of the strong female characters in Shakespeare plays were my role models. And going back to some of the themes we've talked about, I think that education is a key part of opportunity and equality. And the Royal Shakespeare Company is an extraordinary education charity, not just a performance charity. And when we go into classrooms, there are different ways that we have of teaching using actors. We don't use text, the actors speak. It completely changes a child's approach to learning. And we're also a research organization, so we've researched that we can take the literacy levels, which are shockingly 70% on average in the UK. We can take it from below the average because we only work in disadvantaged schools. We can take it from below 70% to above 90% just by the teaching methods that we use. And I think that if we're going to talk about participation and equality, we're going to have to raise literacy and numeracy standards for everybody everywhere. And I hope that a little bit of what we do can help.
Thank you. Shriti, thank you so much for all your insight and sharing. May we now proceed to the question and answer sessions. And I'm sure that lots of people would like to ask questions from you to tap on your words of your thoughts and words of wisdom. And may I just remind the audience that you could raise question by submitting your question via the question and answer box on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, Shriti, we have the first question from Luann Lim, the Chief Executive of HSBC Hong Kong. Luann, please.
Thanks, Moses. Hi, Shriti. My question is on inequality, a subject I know you're very passionate about. So the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities. It's posed absolutely disproportionate burden on the poor, the ethnic minorities, and other vulnerable segments of our society. The recent supply shocks in commodities is not helping. It will translate to and transmit higher prices to consumer goods, and then it will aggravate social inequalities further. So my questions are, what are your views on the widening wealth gap and social inequalities as a result? And therefore, the implications on financial institutions. And do you see philanthropy as one of the main solutions, or are there other kinds of enablement, like increasing financial inclusion, for example, that should be considered and promoted? Thanks.
Thanks, Luann. Thank you so much, because, as you say, this is very close to my heart. And I would like to say that, first of all, this trend existed well before COVID. And in fact, some of it was seen to have started after the financial crisis. And if you track the share of capital versus the share of labor in wealth creation over a 70-year period, you'll see it's been reasonably stable since the Second World War, and then it started to diverge, with the share of capital increasing and the share of labor decreasing. And then, of course, we have the pandemic, which has disproportionately affected certain segments of society, but also inflation is incredibly regressive. And so, inflation fueled poverty, a cost of living squeeze, we're going to see this really come through in a strong way. The fact that the trend existed before, I think, points to something a bit more structural. And as I said, there are points in industrial and technological revolutions where this happens. It's very dislocating, and the institutions around competition don't work. The institutions around distribution don't work as well, and you have to find a different structure. So post the Industrial Revolution, that share of capital and labor did the same thing. It sort of started to diverge. And what they had was unionization, a focus on education, then certain levels of standards and wages, etc., that created a moderation that lasted a long period of time. And I think we are going to have to find our own version of this, of ensuring that the balance is fair and just. I think that philanthropy is laudable, but if the problem is structural, then simply a distribution of some wealth at the discretion of the wealthy is not necessarily going to be the complete answer. I'm not going to say that people shouldn't do it. They should do it. But I think the answer needs to be somewhat more structural, related to policy and related to how we participate in the economy. If the traditional way of participating in the economy, which is you rock up to work, you exchange your time and your labor for wages, if that isn't going to be enough, then we're going to have to find different ways of doing this. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I know that's a little radical. But...
Thank you, Shriti. The second question is from Thomas Zhang, President Asia of the Principal Financial Group. Thomas, please go ahead.
Thank you, Moses. Good afternoon, Shriti. Thank you so much for your very insightful remarks, which cover a lot of breadth and as well as a lot of depth. And I think it's fair to say that you left many of us breathless. So thank you again. I think picking up from some of your remarks that you made, I think the way I see it today, there's a myriad of issues, and some of it you've mentioned earlier: rising interest rates, stagflation risk, disruption to global supply chains, climate change, social inequalities, and they're shaping up to be almost a perfect storm for companies that are operating globally. So, Madam Chair, as someone who sits on multiple boards around the world, what advice would you give to leaders today to steer their businesses in this increasingly challenging environment? And is it still realistic to expect companies to become global companies? Or are they just going to be multinational corporations with selected international footprints, just as Prudential UK seem to have gone in that direction? Just appreciate your comments on those questions.
Thank you. I hesitate to give advice to an eminent business leader who I'm sure all of you have faced all of these issues in the past. It is, I agree, an extremely difficult and tricky time. For me, I don't know if this is advice, but it's just something that I feel that I grapple with a lot, which is to find the balance as a leader between providing reassurance to your people because they need you to look and to feel confident and to give a sense of the direction and going forward. And on the other hand, not providing false comfort and treating them as adults who need to understand the uncertainties in the directions that we might be taking as companies. And sort of finding that balance as a leader is really tricky. And it's really important, at least I find it's really important for me to continue to remind myself to recalibrate that and make sure that at points the uncertainty doesn't feel overwhelming, but that you're there as a figure for reassurance as well. I think that boards have a very important role to play because of their composition, that should be diverse in the true diversity of thinking sense, and because they have the luxury a little bit of standing back from the operations of a business, that they can take the step back and they can look at things from different points of a prism and look at the things that might be coming over the horizon, where if the management of the company are very focused on the daily challenges that they face, you have to take the step back for them and help them look through over the horizon to the risks that are coming, because there's so many, as you say, that are coming at the same time. So I don't know if that's any help at all, but those are the things that that I think about a lot. In terms of whether companies can be truly global, I suspect it depends on your sector and on the type of business that you are. I am certainly happy that the Prudential is focused exclusively on Asia and Africa. I think that is the correct business issue, as well as having the collateral benefit, shall I say, of making the management of political and geopolitical risks a lot easier. But the important thing was that it fitted with our, it fitted with the business strategy. So if you have a product that is going to be truly global, I think it would be difficult to essentially confine yourself. But I think that the days of just going global for the sake of a chief executive's ambition are well over, probably.
Right. Next, we have Michael Chan, the co-CEO of Bowtie Life Insurance, a young and vibrant virtual insurance company in Hong Kong. Michael, please go ahead.
Thank you, Moses. And thank you, Shriti, for the very interesting sharing. I particularly enjoyed the suggestion for requiring history exams. That did make me laugh. But it is quite relevant.
I'm sure a lot of my people won't be thanking me for that one.
Maybe the insurance authority is paying attention. I think that's a good thing. So I did have a question. You've obviously had a very long and distinguished career. You've constantly won a lot of trust. And I'm wondering, from the outside in, it seems like everything was so well and so smooth. But if you had a chance to go back and maybe, let's say, actually our company's average age is about 29 years old. So if you had a chance to go back to your 29-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself and what would you have done differently?
That's a tricky one, Michael. That's a tricky one. I didn't have a career plan, actually. So when you say things went smoothly, I mean, my career is not something that I would recommend to anybody. It was all sort of serendipity. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was just basically following whatever door opened and whatever opportunity presented itself. And I don't regret that. But I think that what probably I would say to myself is, first of all, just chill and enjoy it more. And just go. It's the ride that is enjoyable, not the destination. So you've got to just enjoy it. And I guess I wish I'd been less sort of intense and working around the clock all my life. So enjoy. And I think the second thing probably is when things don't work, when things aren't as enjoyable. It's good to have perseverance, and it's good to stick with it because it does come through in the end. But I wonder whether I stuck with things a little too long. And I wonder whether occasionally I should have cut my losses a little bit earlier. And it goes back to enjoying it, really.
Shriti, we have received a lot of questions in the question and answer box, but I must apologize to the members and friends that we won't have time to answer all the questions. But one very short question and a very interesting one. And Shriti, the question asks, do you see a new era of deglobalization?
I think about this a lot, and I don't know if I would call it deglobalization. I would certainly say that the height of continuing globalization has probably, at least in my personal opinion, passed. And that the potential that we saw once there was this globalization of manufacturing in particular, and then financial capital that went through from the 90s onwards, the next step and stage would have been around services. And I don't see that phase arriving in the way that we had possibly originally imagined. I do see fragmentation, perhaps rather than deglobalization, in terms of regionalization and the creation of blocks. And you can see that through trade blocks and trade policies that have come through in very different ways from a global trade agreement. So I think that is going to be a trend. And I do see one other negative, which is in a technological way, the interoperability of the world is definitely decreasing. Yes, in a technological way, interoperability is decreasing. We have a lot of data nationalism, and we have maybe sixth and seventh generation of technology will be not interoperable at all. But in a wider, broader economic and political sense, our ability to function across borders is very severely changed from the way it was. So it's a bit more complex than deglobalization. I don't think we're going backwards in terms of trade flows or the flows of financial capital, but it is certainly fragmenting. And this is the space to watch, I think.
Right. Shriti, I believe that we are approaching the conclusion of this webinar. And on behalf of all my fellow AOF members and friends, I would like to thank Shriti again for your incisive insight on so many important and relevant topics. And I said before, we hope that not too long in the future, we'll see you here back in Hong Kong, meeting us face to face. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank our members and friends for joining us today. In the coming months, the Hong Kong Academy of Finance is going to arrange more leadership webinars. Our next webinar is scheduled to be held on the 12th of April and will feature Mr. Joseph Yang, Fellow of the Academy, and Professor Huang Yiping of the Peking University. They will discuss macroeconomic developments, Fed tightening, and offshore renminbi market development. We shall have another webinar on the 3rd of May with Nobel laureate Professor Michael Spence, who will share with us some of the important paradigm changes in our world today. If you would like to know more about this program, please follow Academy of Finance on LinkedIn by scanning the QR code on the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again. Good evening, good day, and goodbye. Thank you very much.